Hi everybody, it's Undaunted Week here on OnTableTop.com, and we have a huge prize bundle that you could win. Our lucky winner will receive copies of Undaunted Normandy, North Africa, Reinforcements, Stalingrad, and we're even throwing in a signed copy of the Roland's Revenge art book. Get your comments in on the YouTube channel and on OnTableTop.com for your chance to win.
Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. I'm joined today by Roland MacDonald and Robbie MacNiven, two of the driving forces behind the look and feel for Undaunted Stalingrad, because this is a very much a different take on the Undaunted series, while still being very familiar. It has a more epic narrative behind it, and these gentlemen are responsible. So it's great to have you with us on the channel today.
Hello.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
I'm going to start with Robbie. Undaunted Stalingrad experience, I think is the best way to put it, is a branching narrative. How did you get involved with it? Did Osprey reach out to you, or was this, you've been working in collaboration with Osprey for a while, or how did it come about?
It was a little bit of both. So I first started working for Osprey via their historical side. I'd written a couple of books for their various series about, it was actually the American Revolution that I did. And I knew they had a game side. I knew of the games. And I come from a gaming background, I guess, so I was interested in that. I can't actually remember if I reached out initially and said, have you got any work? Just sort of a cold email, essentially. Or if they actually got in touch with me. But it snowballed from there, really. It was the initial contact I'd already made with the other half of the company, essentially. And then, it was just an initial brief that they're making another Undaunted game. I knew of Undaunted. I hadn't played the previous ones, but I was aware of them, and that they were hoping to add some color text to it, basically. And initially, it wasn't going to be a great deal of color text, but luckily for me, it turned out to be a great deal of color text. So that was sort of my in. Yeah,
and for people who aren't aware, I'll pop them up here very briefly. There are two books that are, I wouldn't say light by any means, but Undaunted itself is a large narrative showcasing both sides, the Germans and the Soviets within the city as they fight for control. What was the project like then? You said it sort of was going to be a very light touch originally, but it's blended into something much, much larger.
Yeah, I think I was just lucky in so much as I think the designers liked what I was doing, so they gave me more and more leeway. I think, if I remember correctly, in terms of word count, it's about 18,000 or just under 20,000 words of color text, which is that's fairly chunky. That's sort of a novella size almost. So it does have quite a story backing. Initially, it was quite light in terms of backgrounds, in terms of what I had to put in. So they had the scenarios, which I had no part in creating in terms of a design standpoint, but they wanted the characters that sort of populated the scenarios. They had names for them, and I think they had names for them, and they had their rank. So, a captain, commissar, things like that. Yeah. But there was no other detail beyond that. It was just sort of this character is maybe quite feisty, and that was it. So I got to kind of come up with the characters, essentially, and trying to come up with something that it was sort of light in so much as I didn't have many words to play around with for each mission. Yeah. Quite a lot of the volume comes because there's quite a lot of scenarios, and because it sort of branches, all sorts of variables are included as well. So the actual each story is very short. I think it's less than 500 words for each little section. So it couldn't be, the way if you were, because I'm an author by trade, so I do novels mostly. So there's no chance to sort of build up over a very long period in terms of going into depth about each character. But I found that the sort of the style of the way it was laid out naturally progressed how the characters interacted, so it wasn't too difficult from that standpoint.
Yeah. I suppose the other thing then is you're not dealing with a single character following a single storyline as well. These narrative shots essentially bookend scenarios and they're not always the same person involved in the immediate following scenario. Did you end up having to plot out a like a narrative for win versus loss, or was it more sort of free flowing? You just had to make sure that if A won and then they were moving on to this scenario, and then if they lost that, then they would have a couple of outcomes for it, or is it just like I suppose like short stories or snapshots?
Yeah, it was fairly free flowing. It was just a case of taking it mission by mission, and I quickly started to understand how the actual structure of it worked, so you can kind of predict what's coming up next, especially since the campaigns are sort of mirrored. So yeah, I cottoned on fairly quickly as to how the system of it worked and the best way to try and do it, keeping it sort of flowing and relatively light, but at the same time, it is very much a snapshot. It's not like a slowly built up scene or multiple chapters. It throws you in, and then you get 500 words, which hopefully sort of sets out what's happening and draws the player in and gives some background to, it's not just a description of how you fight this mission. These are the actual people, the personalities involved, which I guess that's the human touch that they were really wanting to add to the game.
Yeah, it certainly came across for me. I remember, I want to say it was Max. It may not have been. Names may change, but German officer NCO who had been quietly hoarding a bar of chocolate for some time and had been eating sliver by sliver, and it got caught on by a reinforcement who'd been sent in to give him a mission. And it's just like, this is my chocolate, but you've seen me with it. I'm not going to hide it now. And I like that. I like the human touch, because within a game like this, it's very easy just to look at them all as sort of counters and just material on the tabletop. But it does add a lot more without getting into actual specific historically accurate people. It still gives you the feel and flavor of the sides who were fighting, actually having the boots on the ground and going through it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was also quite happy with the fact that it's historically based, but it doesn't really go super into depth. Initially, I thought that's what I should try and do. Just for example, a lot of the weaponry is just described as like a submachine gun, as opposed to the specific type of Soviet weapon that was used. And my first instinct was that I should use the correct terminology. But the editorial team said, well, don't sort of get too in depth, because we're trying to keep it sort of light and flowing. And it's about the characters. It's not about the nitty gritty of the accuracy, which is a bit of a relief, because although I've done quite a lot of military history, it's all sort of 18th century. So World War II is, I know it, but it's not. It's not sort of I'm not buff on it. So it was more about the writing than making sure that it's the right type of hand grenade that's getting used.
Yeah. I suppose in the grand scheme of things, very few soldiers, when they're in the trenches, are likely to go, hand me the M4 fragmentation grenade.
That is very true as well,
the numbers don't really mean so much. But yeah, it's a spectacular work on the narrative side. And it's equally spectacular when we come to Roland's illustrations. You've worked on previous Undaunted.
I've done the whole series.
But this time, it's a lot more illustrations going into it.
Yeah, this was a very epic. There's a lot in here. It's like 2 or 3 times, well, 3 times the size of the others, really. Yeah.
Did that mean that you had to approach it in a different way, or did it give you more freedom, I suppose, with not being as constrained as previous?
I've never really been constrained so much with it. It was more the way that I had to approach it over time had to be different, just because the sheer volume of it meant just focusing on maps until the tiles were done would have just been sort of mentally exhausting. So it was just switching back between the characters and then the maps and then the fog of war and the cover, and just sort of bouncing from one thing to another, so you don't just get a tunnel vision or burnt out on one thing. So and there was enough there that you could move between one and the other. And Osprey just need the work at the end. They don't need it in between stages. So it meant I didn't have to finish something before. Which
is handy. Talking about the maps, then the city of Stalingrad itself plays a big role in the game, almost narratively as well, because unlike previous Undaunted games, the city changes over time. The tiles change. So people can fortify an area, or the area can be shelled into oblivion, which means
it's really part of the gameplay here.
So when you were mapping it out, did you base it on specific areas of Stalingrad and follow it realistically, or was it a lot more take the broad strokes of the city's sort of routes and avenues?
It structurally maps a section of Stalingrad fairly tightly, but it's loose because it still needs to function first as a game. All the main buildings that were part of the situation are there. The position might be slightly adjusted, or a street might be slightly different to what it was. But in general, it's not a simulation ever, this game. Undaunted's never been that. It's more of an experience of the thing. And here as well, it's not absolutely accurate, but it's very tightly based on what it is so that it can also still function well as the game with square tiles that it is. So, yeah.
And then the core of the game was obviously a deck building game. And here you had, I suppose, a bit more structure within what was coming into the game, but at the same time, there's still also alternatives because, like North Africa, where there's individual soldiers named on the cards, you have that again in this game, but also you have almost wounded or upgraded versions of them, whether they become sort of veterans. Did that mean you're always starting with that in mind, that there was always going to be a triptych for the main?
The brief had everything laid out in it so that you knew all the characters that were starting in the base decks, or the core characters, and then know what they're upgrading to. So I know what weapons they'll be upgrading onto. With some of the leaders, like Robbie's probably well aware, as he worked on that. So they have certain character traits, and certain events will adjust how the illustration will look on the next card. So I think there's a female officer, and she comes in all feisty, but if she takes a bit of a bad turn in the game, some of the wind gets knocked out of her sails, and then it's putting that into the narrative, into the illustration as well. So there's a little nod to the narrative as well. So all of that's in there. And then also there's the reinforcements that come in if your troops are really taking a beating. So and trying to make that also feel like upgrades and feel like you're being really heavily punished for taking the losses and things. And there's a lot more room here to make a story out of those upgrades and cards, because there is more and there is variation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I really liked was whenever you see a reserve come in, and somebody like this, and he's a reserve rifleman, and then on his card, I'm going to guess because there's a German very similar, he doesn't actually have a ranged attack anymore outside of the same square, and it's just like, well, he's been reduced from being a rifleman to just wielding an entrenching tool. And
just here you go, have a spade. Hope if someone dies, maybe you get to pick up a gun. I mean, that's nice. I enjoyed having the reinforcement part, or not enjoy, but it really fits the game. It fits the scenario of Stalingrad so well. And it's such a brutal and awful battle that descends into chaos so quickly. And people were really just being sent out, and in the Russians' case as well, and sent out in two together with one gun between them. So one of them would have had a spade or a stick or a rock. And then if the other one dies, then you get the gun. Otherwise, you don't get a gun, kind of thing. And it's nice to feel that coming into the game, that desperation as well. So kind of almost overdid the bedraggled nature of the reinforcement. So you really feel that the tide is going against you, and that those people are really feeling embattled.
It really sells it when you see them. Because the minute you bring one of those cards out of your deck, or when you pull them into your hand, then you know you're not going to be really at full fighting effectiveness.
With a bit of a sigh,
I just want to have a look at the Fog of War cards for a moment and briefly talk about your art style. It has a very sort of watercolor feel to it. How do you actually do your illustrations? Is it
everything's still digital? So I mean, that's sort of just necessary for speed. There's so much content in these games and so much requirement for variety. It's just lots of little tricks to make things feel a bit softer, and blending colors and using filter modes and texture overlays to get to simulate that sort of watercolor feel. And I think as well, I mean, that's why the feel was chosen for the Undaunted series as well. It's a war game, but it needs to feel like it's moving all the time. It wants to feel action, and I think the sort of softness isn't fixed. It's not really tight and permanent. So it's not just an illustration; it's a moment. Even the illustrations for the people, they're like you could have drawn all the details really tightly and got all the correct symbology perfect on the cards, but it's more important that you get the feeling of them doing the thing they're doing and moving, and some expression on their face that shows fear or determination or something. And so that combines well with that watercolory effect, which is sort of loose in the same way that a lot of the background elements in the game have a looseness that enable you to inject your own narrative as well.
Yeah, they are absolutely gorgeous. Is there any particular pieces of artwork that stand out for you then when you were working on them? Or
yeah, there's the one that sort of signifies the game for me is there's a later in the game you can get a low morale card, and I can show you the art for that. That's it's based on the Fog of War cards, but it has its own. It has some worn-out troops. I'll just quickly show you that. So the feel of this, it doesn't have the black lines of the character illustrations. This is more like the Fog of War cards, which is roughly how it functions in a way. But yeah, it's just really this sort of broken moment, the city apps destroyed, and this moment of despair. And this really symbolizes sort of the underlying theme of the game, really.
Slumped against each other and sort of trying to catch
lost in their own thoughts or trying to,
Yeah, it's an absolutely wonderful illustration, with obviously this being a big expansion over previous games. Do you think that this is a sort of format that you'd like to revisit in the future with the alternative types of the same troop and changing the
it was that was one of the things coming into this. Like, this was a long slog. I don't know how long I worked on this, but at least 4 months, I think, which is longer than I normally work on board games. Most projects are usually like 2 months. So just the sheer number of troops by the end, getting into the final troops in Squad C kind of thing was a slog, and I was glad that that the next Undaunted wasn't going to be more guys with guns.
Oh yeah.
They asked me shortly after finishing Stalingrad, like, "Are you up for one more?" Like Philip, who was the director then, he knew that I was kind of done with soldiers for a while. So it was nice that it was going to be Battle of Britain. But I'm happy to go back to it if we carry on the series. I mean, different environments and different scenarios are fun. And each box as well, I've tried to just partly to keep my own interest, but also to represent the different scales. I've slightly adjusted the illustration style in them. So Stalingrad, everything's a little bit tighter. So in the original Undaunted Normandy, it's very loose watercolory, and the backgrounds are more like splashes and watercolor effects. Here I wanted it to feel more grounded in the city and be a bit more gritty. So the color is a bit tighter, and the backgrounds for all the cards, it's more like rubbly walls and crumbled things rather than just an abstract splatter of color, right? Yeah, so injecting a different flavor into each one keeps me interested, but it also makes each box individual, I think, as well, which is really nice.
And what about yourself, Robbie? Would you reattach yourself to Undaunted in the future to do more narrative, or has this sort of fired you up to go off and do some more novels?
No, I'd love to. I'd absolutely love to. I would. Don't really know too much about flying Spitfires and stuff, but I'm sure I can. But I really enjoyed the project. It was quite, for me, it wasn't quite too much of a slog. I think it was a couple of months. And because the word count, although it's quite high for this kind of product, it's very small compared to writing a novel. So in that sense, it's almost refreshing to get to do that. I would really enjoying doing more of it.
Yeah, I'd have to say I've been blown away by Stalingrad. I've enjoyed all of the Undaunted series that I've played anyway, but just, I suppose, the freshness of actually looking at a narrative campaign rather than just a count up how many victory points you've won over time. It gives a much different feel to the whole affair whenever you know that if you throw men away needlessly, then you just won't have them next time that you're called to action. And it makes you view the whole game in a lot more, I suppose, pragmatic way. That soldiers aren't just tokens to be wasted on the battlefield if you require them for the next mission, and they're substandard, then you're probably going to fail. And once the rot sets in, it's very difficult to get it back. But I would love to see another narrative adventure from the Undaunted series in the future. And thank you very much for joining us today, folks.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, absolute pleasure.
Well, there you have it. If you've any questions about Undaunted Stalingrad, please feel free to drop them below. And if there's anything particular, I will pass it across to the guys or Osprey. Until next time, bye-bye.
Hi everybody, it's Undaunted Week here at OnTableTop.com, and we have a huge prize bundle that you could win. Our lucky winner will receive copies of Undaunted Normandy, North Africa, Reinforcements, Stalingrad, and we're even throwing in a signed copy of the Roland's Revenge art book. Get your comments in on the YouTube channel and OnTableTop.com for your chance to win.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.